Most essential thing to follow Vedic astrology is to have your Vedic birth chart. And you can get that now at my site, quietmindastrology.com/free birth chart. And you'll see there's a North Indian style birth chart. That's the main thing we use a lot. But if you scroll down, you'll see there's this section called Dasha. And you see RASU. What does that mean? Well, the Dasha is the 120-year life cycle that we all live through. And we all go through the 9 grahas, Rahu, Ketu, Sun, Jupiter, etc., over several years. So there is a sequence to this. So the Ketu Dasha is 7 years, the Venus Dasha is 20 years, the Sun Dasha is 6 years, the Moon Dasha is 10 years, Mars is 7 years, Rahu is 18 years, Jupiter is 16 years, Saturn is 19 long years, and Mercury is 17 years. So where you start in that sequence depends on your moon nakshatra. If you were off by a day or several hours, then your whole dasha might be different. But generally, that's going to take a couple of days to really change. So if you're just off by a few hours, your dashas are probably pretty close to your accurate dashas. But if you're not sure about your birth time, schedule a reading with me. We'll rectify it. I include that at no additional cost in my readings. And I have an episode about this in the archives if you want to go back to that. But the Dasha, Ketu Dasha is always 7 years. The Venus Dasha is always 20 years. No matter when you started, no matter what Dasha you're born in, or what age of life you're starting in, you might be born at the end of the Venus Dasha. So you only actually get a couple of years of it instead of the full 20 years. And then you go right into the Sun Dasha in your younger years. This is different for everybody. Again, where you get on this ride of these dashas depends on your moon nakshatra and the pada that it's in, the exact degree of the moon. So it's important to have accurate birth time for this. So once you have that and you know, okay, this is what the dasha is, what does it mean? Well, then you got to look at the chart. So rather than just use theory, we're going to use a real life example of Ozzy Osbourne, who recently passed away. Rest in peace. And a very generous, beautiful soul who created a lot of significant music that touched a lot of lives, including my own and the people around me. So I was very touched when he passed away, and it's very moving. But with a lot of respect and honor to him and his family, I would like to use his chart to show us, to help us understand how these energies can play out. And we can learn from this. And we can see from an example of a real life person how the dashas can play out. So you see, if you're watching the video, he was born in the Venus Dasha, which again, it's where you get on in the Dasha timeline depends on your moon nakshatra. So the Dasha for Venus technically is starting in 1941 based on his timeline, not based on the year. Anyone born in 1941 could be born in any Dasha, depends on your day of birth and the moon Dasha. But for him, technically it would be 1941, but he was actually born on December 3rd, 1948 at 6 a.m. in Marston Green, Warwickshire, United Kingdom. So he's born in 1948, which is towards the second third or first, after the first third of the Venus Dasha. So 41, the Venus Dasha starts, 48, he's born. So now he's already in the Venus Dasha as a child. And what does that mean? Well, we've got to look at what Venus is doing in the chart. To understand your Dasha, you got to understand the full birth chart and even eventually the D9 as well. But we look to what is that planet doing in the chart and all the things related to it. One of the metaphors for a Dasha is that you have this tree of your life that's going to live 120 years. And at certain points in your life, certain fruits are ripe on that tree. And of course, not everyone is going to live to 120 years. So not all of those fruits will ripen in the lifetime. We won't get to experience all of those things. For Ozzy Osbourne, he's passed away in his Saturn Dasha, so he did not experience the Mercury or Ketu Dasha later in life. But he did live a long life, longer than many people expected for his history. And he's talked about himself many times, drug addiction and things like this. But part of that, we're going to just kind of do an overview here, and then we'll get into the Dasha. So we see Venus Dashas first, and that's in his first house. So he's finding himself in the Venus Dasha. And with Ketu there in the Venus Dasha as well, there is a desire to lose oneself. Anyone who has Ketu in the first house and Rahu in the seventh is going to really benefit from a strong relationship or emphasizing relationships or be very much driven and supported by their relationships. And Ketu in the first house is a willingness to lose yourself and just devote yourself to others. And it's very beautiful energy expressed in his chart by getting into the marriage that he got into later in life And his wife being such a hugely instrumental part of all of his success later in life. And she, in many ways, many people say like she extended his life by many years. And having that relationship meant a lot to him. And of course, he had uh, issues with escapism and addiction and cheating on his wife and things like this. And these can come with Ketu and Venus together in the first house, where is a need to lose yourself, to go into more, it could be more spiritual things and like moksha, liberation, and you get into a spiritual path and meditation. I don't think he got so much into that. He did get into Christianity, but he wasn't so public about all this. But we do know he lost himself in his music a lot. So Venus is the artistic expression and the artist. So to have Venus in the first house is very good for any sort of artist, musician, creator, creative of some point, of some way. And it also puts the relationship very connected to the self. But again, all of this is pointing to Rahu, opposite of Ketu, always opposite in the seventh house of this desire to focus on others. And many people who liked his music and followed him would agree that he was an amazing performer and he just gave a lot to the audiences and was very generous as a performer, toured his whole life all the way to the end. And even at the end, having this big charity event and raising millions of dollars for charity as his last concert and then passing away just a couple weeks later. So his whole life is a sense of not about himself so much as giving. But of course, there is ego with this. There is a sense of like his name became front and center. But he was actually kicked out of Black Sabbath. He would have probably stayed in Black Sabbath longer if they didn't kick him out. So there wasn't a sense of him needing to be so egotistical and do his own thing like sometimes happens in bands where they go out on their own. It was more like he got kicked out of the band because he was too much into his addiction. That's Ketu in the first house of Venus. Not for everybody. So again, this is like how he expressed these energies. Doesn't mean everybody with Ketu and Venus in the first house will have addiction issues, but there is a need to lose yourself in something. And he did that positively with music, but negatively with the drugs and addictions. But he seemed to have a good time. So who am I to say it was negative? It didn't seem to be hurting too many people, as far as I understand. But he was losing himself in that. He talks about like going crazy in his songs a lot, and these kind of things like losing yourself. Now, in the Venus Mahadasha, where he's born, Venus is the Yoga Karaka for Libra rising. So that means it rules the first and eighth houses of self and transformation. So he himself was constantly transforming. He even has a song called Changes, sings about going through changes. He tried a lot of things. A lot of people paint him. If you've never listened to Black Sabbath, you might just think they're like some evil, witchy, satanic band. But they have a lot of ballads, a lot of soft songs. They never wanted to be Satanists or evil. They just wanted to explore the dark side of society and the psyche. So he was always into transformation, which is very much eighth house, but he doesn't have anything in the eighth house. But his Yoga Karaka of Venus is in the first house. So there is this strong connection here of the eighth house and transformation. The ruler of the eighth is in the first. He finds himself through transformation. Anyone who has ruler of the eighth in the first finds yourself through transformation. Now, that's all happening a lot during his Venus Dasha, of course, from 1941 to 1961. And he's having this childhood that's marked by hardship and difficulties of Ketu in the first house. And Venus and Swati can bring about experimentation and wanting to find himself and explore different things. So he was very inspired by the Beatles and their originality and their way that they were kind of like one of the first punk bands, really. It's hard to fathom now, but he talks about listening to the Beatles and being super inspired. And then he ends up making a band like Black Sabbath and Ozzy. His metal music is very heavy, but there's a lot of melody influence there. And that's Venus and Swati is very much like going with the flow, feeling the energy. And of course, I talk about George Harrison, a lot of the Beatles. He was Swati Moon, so he's a good example of that energy. He had early exposure to music that aligns with Swati's ability to take in different influences that later fused into heavy metal. And then he goes into his Sun Dasha, 1961 to 1967. And he has Sun in Scorpio, and that's in Jesta. So he's Has this in his second house of wealth, speech, and family. He has his harsh home life. Jesta and Scorpio can be quite intense. There's struggles with money, which again, Jesta and Scorpio, the second house of wealth, can bring some unexpected, deep issues around money that need to be addressed. Mercury and Sun together can bring a strong, firm father. Is kind of difficult to navigate. Kind of stubborn father can happen. Kind of intense energy there. But Ozzy later goes on to be known as the Prince of Darkness. So the Prince is Mercury. The Sun is like a leader, the king kind of energy. But when it's with Mercury, there's kind of this more Prince energy. And the darkness is, of course, Scorpio and Jesta. So Prince of Darkness. Again, not everybody with Mercury, Sun, and Jesta is going to be Prince of Darkness, but that's how it expressed for him. And again, with his strong ties of the first house ruling the eighth house, the transformation is part of the self, the darkness part of the self. And then Ketu, the losing of the self, this willingness to go into these darker areas of the world, very present there. And the Sun here in the second house can bring a battle for survival and harsh speech. And that's Sun and Mercury together in Scorpio. So he's singing about harsh, intense things. What he communicates about is intense, but also his speaking voice is very like mumbling a lot, like kind of like that. You've probably heard it, this kind of thing. And again, I say this with great respect. I don't mean to like mock him or anything like that, but that's often how he speaks. And it's this kind of Scorpio energy. So Mercury moves fast. Scorpio is sudden changes. So there's this sort of sudden change, fast moving energy around his voice. Like maybe he's talking faster than he's processing, or he's not communicating at the speed that he's trying to. And maybe that's from drug abuse. Maybe it's from potentially he had Parkinson's much earlier in life and it wasn't diagnosed. That's something that recently has come out, as he was diagnosed with Parkinson's later in life around his Saturn Dasha, which we'll get to later. But it's possible he had this diagnosis earlier in life. And that can be part of this energy of Mercury in the second house in Scorpio, could be a speech impediment. Because Mercury, again, quick moving, Scorpio, sudden changing. And then the Sun there also in Jesta brings more intensity to this. But he harnesses all of that very nicely into singing. And a strong second house, like Sun in the second house or Mercury in the second house, is a very good placement for a singer. And we see this a lot with singers, but usually it's not Scorpio in the second house. This is good for a metal singer, but more like pop singers. It might be Sun or Mercury in the second house and Venus or something like that. But this is what he has. And as he's going into Sun Dasha, he starts going into singing and finding his voice in the second house. And he has some jail time for burglary here. The Sun is the authority. The second house is values. And it could be theft because you're seeking resources, because it is resources. But with the Jesta part, it's like some secretive way of getting the resources can happen here. There's some strong ego clashes here. He's finding his unique identity as a young man. And then he goes into his Moon Dasha, 1967 to 1977. And he has the Moon in Sagittarius and Purvashada in the third house. So he's learning a lot of skills here. Moon is ruling the 10th house of career. So he's moving into more public recognition. Cancer in the 10th house. And this is when Black Sabbath forms in 1968. And this is a very common thing we'll see with Dashas. We see his Dasha starts in 67. He moves into a whole new dimension of reality in 1968 with the band Black Sabbath. Like, he did not have that band. He was on a whole different trajectory. The new Dasha comes in, you're on a new trajectory, you're in a new phase of life. It changes a lot of things. And that band, throughout this whole time, 67 to 77, starts to rise in popularity. And at the end of the Moon Dasha, he is fired from Black Sabbath. And the moon being fickle and tied to mental health, there is some element here of him being in the band, and they all had drug issues they talked about openly. And this is the moon with Mars together can bring some intensity to that. Moon and Mars conjunction is quite an intense energy. So it's good for things like heavy metal, where there's a lot of intense emotion. And then Jupiter here brings some wisdom as well, but it can just bring expansion to wherever it is. So expansion of this intensity of Mars and Moon together. And Moon in Purvashada is quite persistent and strong and hardworking, invincible, pioneering. So he's pioneering a completely new genre and actually many genres of music. There were similar things, but really Black Sabbath is often credited as the band that started heavy metal and doom metal and all sorts of subgenres just from their first album, which they took a different turn than a lot of their contemporaries, which were more blues based. They explored the dark side of music, which Ozzy is very much at home in with all the things we've talked about here. So it's very much in alignment for him to express his musical gifts and his voice in this more dark way and this more melodic way as well, and to pioneer something and to be part of something new. Now, he didn't actually write a lot of the lyrics, but he was the front person and the singer, and in many ways became sort of the image of the band and then his own project as well. So that's Purvashada. It's like this persevering energy that he's endured in the public eye throughout his whole life. And Purvashada has this invincible, pioneering, persevering kind of spirit. And that's his moon, where his mind is. So he's cultivating all that in the moon dasha. And then he moves on to his Mars dasha, 1977 to 1984. And this is where he has his biggest success in his own project. And he's traveling a lot, he's touring a lot. Mars in Sagittarius in Mula nakshatra is with Jupiter in the third house. So this is where you can learn a lot of skills. This is actually very good for marketing and business and these kind of skills. And he actually was very good at getting attention and doing things like biting a head off a fake dove. And then somebody threw a bat into the stage at one of his shows and he thought it was a fake bat and he bit into the head and it turned out to be a real bat. And he got a lot of publicity and attention for that. And it's just kind of natural. Like he wasn't trying to get all this publicity for biting the head off a bat, but he was, probably inebriated at the time and probably didn't really think about it and then had to get a bunch of rabies shots and had some intense stuff there. But Mars in third house for the average person is very good for marketing and business and communication skills. Third house is communication. Mars is active. I see a lot of marketing managers have strong, like Mars in third house. Sagittarius, very good as well, especially for touring and traveling the world. Mars is raw energy and destruction and creation. Mula uproots the old and builds the new. And Mula energy is like very like rooted, like deep energy. And there's an element of heavy metal music that is like very deep and heavy, like Mula, like the roots of things. And Jupiter is one who brings light into the darkness. And Ozzy sings all the time about light and darkness and calls himself the Prince of Darkness, which also ties in with this Jupiter in Sagittarius energy. That's a very lucky energy as well. He's had quite a bit of fortune, and he's said that as well in interviews. So there's a lot of growth and a lot of travel as well. Jupiter in Sagittarius is a lot of travel for work, and third house especially. So he's going solo at this time. He's kicked out of the band at the end of the Moon Dasha, starts his new band. Again, the big Dasha changes. These are big turning points in life, and some more than others. It depends on the chart. But by the mid 80s, like he's full on in his own band. He's got the Blizzard of Oz, big success. He marries his wife, and Mars gives him fire, courage, a reckless edge. And also there's some extreme chaos and a lot of intensity going on. He starts his band, gets a new guitar player, and that guitar player tragically dies at a young age in a plane crash. So there is this constant transformation around him. And there is a lot of intensity in the Mars Dasha, a lot of activity, a lot of touring. He's going hard during this time to 1984. And then he moves on to his next Dasha, which is the Rahu Mahadasha. And this is a longer one now, 1984 to 2002. And he has Rahu in Aries in Ashwini in the seventh house. Rahu can be extremes, addictions, fame, breaking taboos. Ashwini is about speed. It's a healing energy as well, about impulses. It fits his reputation for insane antics, substance abuse. So he's trying to medicate himself with substances, which Rahu and Ashwini can do. And there's shocking behavior. Rahu can be shocking and intense. Aries, Ashwini can be very fast and sudden. This is when he really builds that Prince of Darkness image, which is always present to some degree in the chart from the things we talked about. But in the late Rahu Dasha, he moves on to the Osborns and brings fame to his family. It's the perfect Rahu expression of reality TV breaking norms. Again, really innovating and starting something new. And Rahu and Ashwini is very innovative. So we haven't really touched on this yet, but it's already been present throughout his whole life. Having the first heavy metal band and now going out solo, starting his own project, initiating a new band, and also becoming equally, if not more successful, which is quite incredible and rare to have that happen for somebody to go solo and be equally or more successful. And then he moves on to start the first ever reality TV show about a celebrity family, which now is like super normal and it's been done to death. But back then, there was reality shows like Survivor and game shows and stuff, but nobody was doing this, and they were the first ones to do it, which was basically like an evolution of MTV Cribs. Kind of interesting. Like, oh, we're just gonna do this for a couple of days, film their new house, and then it turns into years, and it naturally evolved into this new thing. That again, Ozzy being lucky, Jupiter in Sagittarius, and being very supported by his wife Rahu and Aries in the seventh house, she did a lot of this work to start this reality show. Also started one of the biggest music festivals in this time of Ozfest. So again, his wife helping a lot with that, and continuing to innovate, continuing to struggle with addictions, doing lots of major songs and a lot of success in this time. So a lot of fame. This is probably his fame peaking, you could say. By 2002, he becomes really a household name. So he's touched multiple generations and gained a lot of success. And not everyone with Rahu and Aries is going to have all that success, but he had the benefit of a very ambitious partner, Sharon, which I haven't looked at her chart, but would be interesting as well to see their synastry. But Rahu in the seventh for the native is going to bring in a partner who brings in a lot of energy to the life and a lot of innovation, ability to get stuff done. And then we move into the Jupiter Mahadasha 2002. So this is around the time he has a big car accident. He has some health crisis. So we're in a new dasha. Jupiter in Sagittarius, again, is generally lucky. Third house is media, communication, public voice. Jupiter expands these things. So his reality TV show is coming to an end at the beginning of this time, but there's more documentaries, more awards, more achievements. He's getting in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Lifetime Achievement Awards. He's getting acknowledged for his success. And going through this later in life as he is coming into more of that wise elder energy of Jupiter, rather than if it were earlier in life, it might be a lot of his expansion then. But a lot of his expansion was tied in with addiction and escapism and intensity, which we saw with like Mars and Rahu, and the moon dasha as well, being with the Mars energy there. So quite a growth period time here is Jupiter in the Mahadasha. And one thing I want to touch on is that every dasha in is called the dasha sandhi, or the transitional time, or you could think of it like a bridge. So as I've talked about today already, when you're going from one dasha to another, like when he was going from the moon dasha ending in 1977 to the Mars dasha starting in 1977, there's really like a year or two before and after where you feel the shift happening. It's like you're walking across a bridge, and I imagine it's like a really long bridge, like a wooden plank bridge that's kind of unstable. You don't know what's coming. Like you're going from one stable ground to an uncertain, kind of foggy new place, like across a river or something. And you don't quite know what's there yet, but it's taking shape. And things need to change. And I watched a lot of documentaries about him before this episode. So, like this time period, 77, around there, he's going through a lot of this sense of like he knows something needs to change, and he's bringing a lot of creative ideas to the band, and they're rejecting all of them. And he doesn't want to go solo, and he's escaping into the drugs and all of this. So there's things that's just like they know things need to change, and they have some lawsuit issues, and they feel it's coming, but it kind of takes a time, like a year before and a year after, to really make that transition. So anyone, if you're listening, if you're about to go through or have gone through dashas, look at your own timeline, and you can see those years are the big turning points where it's about a year before and year after on average that you're kind of going through this big transition. The longer the dasha, the longer that transition is. So you're transiting through the dasha sandhi. That's a very personal thing. It's just for you at that time because of your moon nakshatra on the day you're born. So Jupiter Dasha, lots of growth and success. And then he goes finally the Saturn Mahadasha 2018, which would continue to 2037. But he's passed away in 2025. And in the Saturn Mahadasha, Saturn is in Leo in Maga in the 11th house. So again, with every dasha, we got to look at not just the planet, but its placement in the chart and what it can tell us about those energies, because that fruit is now ripe for the native. So Saturn in Leo in Maga specifically in 11th house is about your networks, your legacy, and large groups. Maga is about ancestors, the throne, fame. Saturn here brings recognition for lifelong work, but through health burdens and limitations. Now, specifically health burdens for him, because the 11th house is the end of diseases. The 6th house is diseases. The 11th house is the end of diseases. When you have Saturn in the 11th house, it prolongs the end of the disease. It delays, Saturn delays. 11th house ends diseases. Saturn delays the end of the diseases. So he struggled with health issues throughout this whole time, and they slowly increased and intensified. But with Maga, the throne, he, in his last few years performing, he could not stand or walk. The Parkinson's was too intense. So he could have done a lot of things about that. He could have set up a lot of situations, how to handle this. He could have stopped performing, but instead he created a giant throne to sit on and perform from and develop his legacy. And Maga is all about legacy. And this was, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2019. So heavy karma is surfacing here. The side of Saturn brings about karma to address here. And he ended his life in the Saturn Venus Dasha. Venus is the Lagnesh in the first house. So it's the signifactor of the chart, essentially. It's in the rising sign. So there's a focus on love, family, preserving his art, legacy, tributes, memoirs, reissues, final tours. And he was able to do that. And how beautiful is that? Like to have a life where you start something you love and you influence all these people and you have this big impact. And at the end of your life, you get to celebrate it and essentially have like a big party of all the people you influenced, and they all come together and you raise all this money for charity and you get to have one last performance. Like, it's so beautiful and such a poetic story that he had this last concert, which if you're not familiar, like basically he started Black Sabbath way back in 1967 in that Dasha, and 68 they started. And before them, like there was nothing quite like it. And they influenced all these bands like Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Tool. And then he gets to perform a show and all of those bands are there. Like how incredible is that? It's mind blowing. And a lot of those bands were very influential to me. I grew up listening to them and still do. And I love that music, even though it might seem weird to you as a astrology hippie yogi guy. But I love that music and the melodies of it and the artistry of it and the craft of it. And he paved the way. And then in his Saturn Dasha, which is Saturn's in Maga, he got to really celebrate his legacy and the karma came back. So Saturn brings you the karma of your lifetime. And especially when it's at the end of life like this, later in life, it's bringing the karma of everything you've done. Younger in life, it's bringing karma potentially from past lifetimes, or you're creating a lot of karma of the actions you choose and the things you build in the Saturn Dasha. But he had this karmic return and even called the concert back to the beginning. So it's this big closure of like going full circle, getting the karmic fruits of his effort and celebrated by all of his peers and followers, and getting to end the story with a beautiful closure. And that is the story of Ozzy's life and his Mahadashas. Quite beautiful, quite poetic. Of course, there's so much more I could say, but I hope you got an understanding of the dashas playing out here. And as far as why does life end that when it does? Well, there's so many factors. We have free will, I think, and we can choose things that are in alignment or out of alignment. And along the way, he's made a lot of choices to do a lot of extreme things with his body. And I'm very happy for him that he got to live as long as he did with good health relatively. And I think many people expected that he might not live that long based on what was happening in the 70s and 80s. So he was fortunate and blessed to have a lot of loving family and support around him. And we talked about Venus being the first house. Like he talks about like love all the time. Like, I love you guys. God bless you. Constantly saying this at his concerts and encouraging them to go crazy. Again, that's Ketu in the first house. So there's so much we can learn from him. And he left such a beautiful legacy. So why in at this time in his life, again, there's many factors. I don't like to focus on predicting death, but it is possible with the chart. But the main thing is there's certain energies that we can work with. And whenever dasha you're in, there's potential energies to work with. And you have the choice to bring out the positive, negative, or neutral expression of them. And we can learn from the people who've come before us and brought out the positive expression of their charts. So if you have any of these placements in your chart or whatever dasha you're going through, hopefully this gave you some perspective of how to interpret it for yourself. And if you want guidance on how to do that for yourself, you can schedule a reading with me or sign up for my mentorship program where we go in depth like this for you in your own chart and guide you through how to interpret your dashas in your chart in the Vedic Astrology mentorship. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts, anything you'd like to see in future episodes. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a beautiful day. And as Ozzy would say, God bless you.